The storm had come without warning that September afternoon in Central Park, and by the time Robert Hayes realized what was happening, the path had already turned to thick mud beneath his daughter's wheelchair. Emily sat stranded, her chair sunk deep into the soft earth while rain poured down in sheets, and Robert ran toward her, his expensive suit already soaked through, but his legs weren't what they used to be and the distance felt impossibly far. He watched helplessly as a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, appeared from nowhere, running straight toward Emily without hesitation. The boy was covered in dirt, his clothes worn and patched, but he didn't slow down for even a moment, and Robert felt his heart catch in his throat as he watched this stranger reach his daughter. Marcus had been collecting cans in the park when he saw the girl struggling, and something in him just moved without thinking, because his mama had always said that when someone needs help you don't stop to count the cost. He reached Emily just as she was trying to push her wheels free, her hands slipping in the mud and her face twisted with frustration and fear. Without a word, Marcus bent down and lifted her right out of that chair, his thin arms stronger than they looked, and Emily gasped in surprise, but then she wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. The wheelchair could wait, he decided, and he carried her toward the pavilion about 50 yards away where the roof would keep them dry, and with each step the mud sucked at his worn sneakers, threatening to pull them right off his feet. Emily was quiet at first, but then she started to laugh, a genuine surprised laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep, and Marcus found himself smiling too, even though his arms were burning and the rain was cold against his skin. By the time they reached shelter, Robert had caught up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and he stood there staring at this boy who held his daughter so carefully, like she was something precious. Marcus set Emily down gently on the dry bench under the pavilion, and she kept her hand on his arm for just a moment longer than necessary, her eyes bright with something Robert couldn't quite name. "Thank you," Robert managed to say, and his voice cracked on those simple words because he'd seen what this boy had done without asking for anything, without even knowing who Emily was. Marcus just nodded and turned to go back for the wheelchair, but Robert caught his arm, and when their eyes met, Robert saw something that reminded him of his own father, a man who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and never complained once. The wheelchair was heavy and stuck deep, but Marcus wrestled it free and pushed it back through the mud while Robert stayed with Emily under the pavilion and watched this boy work with a determination that spoke of someone used to hard things. When Marcus returned with the chair, Emily reached out and took his muddy hand in hers, and she said her name clearly, looking right into his eyes like she wanted him to remember it. "I'm Marcus," he replied, and there was a softness in his voice that made Robert think of Sunday mornings and church bells and all the goodness he'd almost forgotten existed in the world. The rain kept falling, but softer now, and Robert found himself asking Marcus where he lived, and the boy pointed vaguely east toward the neighborhoods where Robert never went anymore, where he'd grown up himself before the money came. Emily asked Marcus if he went to school, and he said yes, but he worked too, helping his mama who cleaned offices at night because his little sister needed things and someone had to provide. Robert listened and felt something shift inside him, like a door opening in a room that had been closed for too long. He thought about his own daughter and how the accident 2 years ago had changed everything, had made her quiet and withdrawn, had built walls that even he couldn't breach, but here she was talking to this boy who'd appeared out of nowhere, covered in mud and smiling like she used to smile before. Emily asked Marcus about his sister, and he told her about Keisha, who was 7 and loved to draw, but they couldn't afford art supplies, so she used the backs of old papers and pencil stubs from school. And Emily said she loved to draw too before, and her voice got quiet on that last word, but Marcus just nodded like he understood about befores and afters. The storm began to pass and golden light broke through the clouds, painting everything in warm colors, and Robert made a decision that felt both terrifying and right. He asked Marcus if he'd like to come have dinner with them sometime, and the boy's eyes widened with surprise and maybe a little fear, like he thought it might be a trick. Emily grabbed her father's hand and squeezed it hard, her face lit up with hope, and Robert realized he hadn't seen her look like that in months, maybe longer. Marcus said he'd have to ask his mama, and Robert said of course, and then he did something he hadn't done in years. He wrote his personal number on a card from his wallet and handed it to this boy covered in mud who'd shown more courage in 5 minutes than most people showed in a lifetime. They parted ways there at the pavilion, with Emily waving until Marcus disappeared around the bend, and when Robert pushed her chair back toward their car, she was humming a song he recognized from her childhood. That night at dinner in their Upper East Side apartment, Emily talked more than she had in weeks, telling her mother about Marcus and the rain and how strong he was even though he looked so thin. Catherine Hayes listened with tears in her eyes because she'd watched her daughter fade away after the accident, and here suddenly was a spark of the girl they'd lost. 3 days later Marcus called and his voice was nervous but steady, and he said his mama said it was okay if the invitation was still good. Robert said it was very good, and they set a date for the following Sunday. When that Sunday came, Marcus arrived wearing clothes that had been carefully washed and pressed, and he brought a drawing that Keisha had made, a picture of flowers in bright crayon colors. Emily took the drawing like it was made of gold, and she had Marcus sit next to her at the big dining table, and Catherine served pot roast with potatoes, and Marcus ate slowly, savoring every bite. They talked about school and music and books, and Marcus told them about the library where he went sometimes to study because it was quiet and had air conditioning in the summer. After dinner Emily showed Marcus her room full of things she never used anymore, and he didn't say much, but his eyes took it all in: the art supplies gathering dust, the keyboard against the wall, the shelves of books. Emily asked him if Keisha would like some of the art supplies, and Marcus started to refuse, but Emily said please with such earnestness that he finally nodded. Over the following months Marcus became a regular visitor, and something beautiful began to grow between these two young people who seemed to understand each other in ways that words couldn't quite capture. Robert watched his daughter come back to life, and he thought about how close he'd come to missing this, how he might have just called for help and kept his distance from the muddy boy in the park. But sometimes grace arrives in unexpected packages, and sometimes the people with the least to give offer the most. Years later, when Emily graduated from college, Marcus was there in the front row next to his mother and his sister, who'd just won a scholarship for her art. And when Emily gave her speech, she talked about a rainy day in Central Park and a boy who didn't hesitate, who didn't see difference or wealth or disability, but just saw someone who needed help. She said that Marcus had taught her that strength isn't about what you have but about what you're willing to give, and that kindness is the only currency that really matters. Robert sat next to Catherine holding her hand, and he thought about all the years of business deals and bottom lines, and how none of it had ever made him feel as rich as he did in this moment. Because sometimes it takes a storm to wash away what doesn't matter, and sometimes it takes a stranger to show you what does, and sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the chance to witness true goodness in action. And as the rain had washed the mud from that path in Central Park, so too had Marcus's simple act of kindness washed away the barriers that had separated them all from what really mattered. Which was always and only about love and connection, and the courage to reach out when someone needs help without counting the cost.